Well, today we are looking at a really weird story in this chapter we're looking at today in Genesis 16 about two women not getting on, or so it appears. But actually, what it's about is the most revealing and basic spiritual question you'll ever have to answer. And that question goes like this: so are you going to trust God then, or what? And the follow-up discussion arises out of that concerns patience and impatience with God. So, look, the book of Genesis is made up basically of two main parts. It's the first book in the Bible, and it begins in creation and the paradise, the Garden of Eden, where humanity listened to the Satan who dressed himself up to look like a snake. And they did that rather than listening to God, and humanity therefore spiraled downward in self-destruction, which led right up to the Tower of Babel. You might know that story. And at that Tower of Babel, rebellious humanity is scattered by God, and the different, divided, that's the issue, nations of the world spread out across the face of the earth. Then the second part of Genesis then zooms in on one of the families that have been scattered, focuses on just one family, and right in the middle is this panel of stories about Abraham, the founder of that family, and his faith. So we're looking today at what links the two parts of Genesis together and helps us understand what the whole book is about. And in the story of this book, after that scattering at Babel, there's a genealogy. It follows one of the tribes all the way down to this man Abraham, later renamed Abraham, same man. And God starts to make a set of promises to Abraham, a covenant, that is a pledge to do stuff. And God says he's going to bless Abraham, give him a large family, and that through Abraham and his family, all nations on earth are going to be blessed instead of being broken up and outside God's blessing. They're going to receive again many of the good things they'd lost at the fall into sin and the spiral away from God that had followed on from that. Basically, God is trying to restore the situation, restore humanity back to the experience of the goodness they had in paradise, which was his original intention for the whole of humanity. It's all tied up then with his rescue plan for humanity. And it's through Abraham and his family God has planned to do this, and that's why the whole second half of Genesis is then about this one family of faith, Abraham and his offspring. Abraham has a son called Isaac, who has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons, and so on. And to each generation, God renews his promise to bless both them and all the nations of the world through them. Now, here's a problem. On account of this promise to use this family to rescue the world, people tend to assume the big plan is to restore paradise, or even specially somehow, to those people genetically descended from that one family. But then there's another set of people who read these stories as examples of how to be a good person and then earn the promises made to Abraham and his offspring, that rather than to trust God, to put your faith in him. You know, putting his faith in God was really very clearly stated to be the reason that Abraham got put right with God in the first place, and the key to being a beneficiary of all God's promises to Abraham. So that's a crazy idea as well. We should have realized, not just because that's what's said in Genesis 15:6, slap bang in the middle of these stories, in the middle of Genesis, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, but also for the most part, this family, they're not getting things right. They're getting things wrong. And this family is clearly dysfunctional. They'd never have been put right with God by what they were doing, because what they were doing was terrible. But they trusted God, and God said, therefore you'll be reckoned righteous and put right with me. Well, it starts right here with the great patriarch of that family of God who God intends to use to bring humanity back to paradise. It starts with Abraham himself, whose faith, not his conduct, not his genetics, the Lord has already reckoned to him as righteousness in the previous chapter. It's about faith, putting you right with God. But then, this whole story is about God giving him and his wife Sarah a family, and the huge promise that was central to the purpose of repeopling paradise, a promise which, well, time was beginning to make it look as if that promise was passing by. And it's because of that in this chapter, first of all, verses 1 to 3, what happens is that impatience strikes those who had previously been trusting God. The whole point here, then, is that Abraham's faith and Sarah's fell to impatience. Genesis 16, 1 to 3. Now, Sarai, and that's Sarah, their names get changed after a bit. Abram and Sarai, their names are going to get changed to Sarah and Abraham. Don't worry about it. The whole point here, then, now Sarah, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarah's proposal. There doesn't seem to be much time lag or disagreement. So Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. And this happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. Okay. The passage goes on and records the birth of Ishmael to Abram through this Egyptian woman, and the story illustrates the limits of Abram's faith as he tries to obtain a son through this social custom, you could say, of what we might call surrogate mothering, but we'll come back to that. The barrenness of Sarah poses a challenge to Abram's faith, just as the famine had back in chapter 12. And as in chapter 12, funnily enough, there's an Egyptian also figuring prominently in all of this. Now, we need to acknowledge that childlessness was a serious problem in that culture. And what happens then in response to all of this is that Sarah offers up her menial servant on a plate, as it were, to Abraham. That may well have been to be accepted in the surrounding culture, but Sarah simply sees this as the social custom of having a child through a surrogate. But we need to say that to draw any conclusions about the ethics of modern surrogacy misses the point totally here. That's all test tubes and stuff, right? The context in this account is that God has already promised that he would give a child, against the odds, that he would give a son to Abraham and his wife Sarah together. And what they planned here wasn't going to be anything like a son for Sarah and Abraham together, was it? Hagar was in on the act. Sarah said to Abraham, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." Well, you can't, can you? God had specifically not prevented Sarah from having children with Abraham, so there's a lie in the mix there, in the equation. He'd actually promised that she would have them. And then what God had promised was children for Abraham and Sarah, and what Sarah was proposing was not that. Yet, verse 3. Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, gave her to Abraham as a wife. Just as believing a lie and not taking God at his word led to the loss of paradise back by the tree in the garden, so now the very same thing, believing a lie and not taking God at his word, leads to catastrophe with awful consequences right up until now in this chapter in Genesis 16. Putting it mildly, the immediate result was relationships got poisoned by this in God's world. Relationships are poisoned then in verses 4 to 6. Genesis 16, 4 to 6. So Abraham had sexual relations with Hagar and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. Then Sarah said to Abraham, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abraham replied, "Look, she's your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." And Sarah treated Hagar so harshly, she finally ran away. All this happens against the background that the fundamental inclination of the triune God is to create and preserve good relationships. God is a God who exists in relationships. One God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But of course, there's only one devil, and he hates the unity of divine relationship, doing all he can to dismantle Paradise's characteristic of fundamental unity held alongside the cherishment of core creative individuality. The essence of the relationships that exist within the Godhead lies in relationship within the Godhead. The God is 3 in 1. Well, it all goes wrong here after believing this lie and acting as if God wasn't going to keep his word. Hagar turns toxic. That's the first thing. Verse 4. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt. Honestly, I've seen 2 women in one kitchen in other people's homes in the past. Just funeral teas, and stuff like that. And I've no idea how that can ever work. But this is 2 women sharing one man's bed, and then continuing to live under the same roof, where one of them was the mistress of the house who could not conceive, and the other was the mistress in the bed and rapidly conceived. How's that going to work? Can't begin to imagine how anyone but a desperate person would ever want to resort to this as a way to solve a problem rather than create a fresh, massive one. Well, that's what happened. It created a massive problem. And it's initially Hagar who turns toxic on Sarah. And Sarah then complains. Sarah turns toxic. Verse 5, Sarah said to Abraham, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Now you will notice, this had been all Sarah's idea, which Abraham had gone along with. Now Sarah is doing to her man exactly what the man did to Eve, his wife, in the garden. This is your fault, she says, when actually it was her idea in the first place. Human guilt does this, tries to transfer the guilt. And no doubt Sarah in that culture carried a burden of guilt which she shouldn't have for her childlessness, but now it's gone badly and immensely wrong in another direction. Look at this toxicity here. Hagar turns toxic, Sarah turns toxic, and next, look how surly Abraham seems to be as he replies to Sarah. Verse 6, Abraham replied, "Look, she's your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." The Hebrew says, "She is in your hand," meaning she's in your power. Do to her as you see fit. Now, wait a minute. How's she in Sarah's power? Hagar is a child of Adam. She's Egyptian, so we're told in verse 1, but she's human, and therefore of the genealogy of Adam and Eve, and therefore an image bearer of the Almighty. The Hebrew word for that Egyptian woman is shifcha, and what it means is that Abraham and Sarah have not just got a charlady, but a maidservant as belonging to a mistress, we'd say a household slave. And Abraham turns testy and toxic with Sarah and says, "Well, you have the whip hand with her, you sort it out." He might as well have said, "Over to you then, to treat her as if she were not created in the image of God, like the rest of us." Hagar turns toxic, Sarah turns toxic, Adam turns toxic, but still Sarah did not see the red lights flashing. And we end up where, everybody having turned toxic, Hagar turns tail, and she flees. We're told, verse 6, then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that finally she ran away. The word for what Sarah did means to afflict, to oppress, to humble, to mishandle. Now, I don't know quite what's involved, but comparing the ages then, given for Adam and Sarah in these chapters, I reckon Sarah was about 76 years old at this time. I doubt she was now likely to be a very efficient street fighter. So I'm not sure what Sarah would be handing out in the way of physical beatings. I'm not sure that's involved, I don't know. But whatever it was harsh enough for Hagar to prefer to take her chances alone with her child in the wilderness than to stay around in Abraham's household. And alone with a child in the wilderness of itself seems a fairly threatening prospect. So what was going on back home, I've got no idea. Whatever Sarah did then to threaten and humble Hagar, it was pretty serious. So Hagar put up with it, but finally felt she had to run away. It's all pretty horrible. But something rather beautiful happens next, because God steps in with promises to Hagar's rival lineage. Verses 7 to 12. Genesis 16:7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness, along the road to Shur. Now, hang on a minute. Who's the angel of the Lord? Some identify the angel of the Lord as the pre-incarnate Christ, because in some texts the angel is identified with the Lord himself. But it looks a bit more likely here the angel merely represents the Lord. He can speak for the Lord because he's sent with the Lord's full authority. In some cases in Scripture, the angel is clearly distinct from the Lord, Judges 6:11 to 23, for example. In others, not the case. Okay, well, I'm glad we cleared that up. What next? The angel, we'll say a messenger from the Lord, said to her, Hagar, Sarah's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarah, she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Well, I mean, sometimes the Lord's deliverance doesn't sound very much like deliverance at first. Just now imagine Hagar. Imagine how Hagar could have responded here to the angel. Are you kidding, angel? That woman's a maniac. Have you forgotten? I'm a runaway slave. And as you know, angel, this isn't only about me. What do you think that woman is going to do to my little baby if I go back? Well, okay, we're dramatizing a bit, but you're getting the gist of it. But the angel of the Lord is still speaking. Go back. Submit to her. Then he added, verse 10, I will give you more descendants than you can count. What does that sound like? Well, if you read a bit further on, doesn't it sound like God's promise to Abraham later on in Genesis 22 to give him as many descendants as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the seashore? Sounds quite like that to me. Does seem to be a bit of a reminder there's not one but two Semitic races. Only one of them numbered back through Isaac, and this other through Ishmael. Because, you see, with the huge challenge to her faith to go back, Hagar also receives tremendous promises from God. Verse 11. The angel also said, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. So far, so good. Then verse 12. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. That's pretty untamed. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. Ishmael. You look that name up in the Handbook of the Old Testament, Translator's Handbook of the Old Testament, and you'll find there under the Hebrew word for Isaac, it says the word means he's the son of Abraham, Sarah's handmaid Hagar, and the progenitor of the Arabian peoples. What an interesting way to put it. Here, my friends, is the first mention the Bible makes of so much of the ancient and modern history of the Middle East of two people at war. Hagar will bear Isaac's half-brother Ishmael, and he'll be the father of a numerous people, but the hard fact is the history, or the future from that viewpoint, is going to get very messy. Well, Hagar doesn't refer to that in the response that she makes in verses 13 to 16. Because that's all about the God who sees me, she says. Genesis 16, 13 to 16. Hereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, you are the God who sees me. She also said, have I truly seen the one who sees me? So that well, where the angel was when he found her, was named Beer Lahai Roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. The God who sees me. The thing I so often hear when I listen to people who've gone through or who are going through suffering or personal trauma is that what they want is to be heard and to be seen. We can make the mistake of assuming the person who's going through hard stuff wants to be helped or advised or corrected or something. If they're asking, that's fine, that's great. It's highly appropriate. But time and again, what I find is that people who are going through hard things are making statements, not asking questions. And if we start giving answers to statements, it's often not just inappropriate, that's dysfunctional behavior on our part. I'd cite you by way of example of that the bulk of the book of Job, just to illustrate this point. I think it bears thinking about fairly seriously. What we want is the God who sees me, the God who hears me, the person who sees me on his behalf, the person who hears me on his behalf. What's so significant for oppressed and abused and suffering Hagar is that God sees me and hears me. Important point, but that's to some extent tangential to the big picture of what's actually going on here. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael, and Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Conclusion, what's the point? What's the point of all this story about Sarah and Abram and Hagar and Ishmael? What happens is Abram and Sarah get really old and you begin to think God's promise is going to fail because there's no way they're going to have a kid of their own at that age. In the natural way of things, perhaps that's right. They think the same. They take matters into their own hands, turning from trusting God's promise to finding this cobbled-together solution of their own, which is disastrous. And we end up with Ishmael in a race that will be ever at war with the lineage that God intends to give Abraham. That's the sort of product of the sort of cobblings together that rather than trusting God that we can come up with. But then later on, miraculously, Abraham and Sarah do have a child in God's own good grace and goodness, the right way with no dodgy business thrown in. It's Isaac, and God's promise is, of course, kept. And the lineage of God's covenant with Abraham is preserved. The basic thrust of this story is all about whether you're going to trust God, even when he seems to be taking a long time about doing something that he's promised you. Whether you're going to do that or depend on schemes and devices of human design to try and make his promises happen the way he says they will, but it never quite seems to work out like that. And the question is this: do we recognize that faith entails patience with the promise of God? It's just bound up naturally with faith in and of itself. Faith is content not to have everything handed to you in your way, to your specification, and to have it now. Are you up for that faith? This faith that, as for Hagar, might seem dangerous to act on. It might mean going back to or enduring circumstances that seem most threatening. In the faith that God sees you and hears you and can be trusted, even on the days when faith looks scary. See, faith in the Bible is not simply faith that. Faith in the Bible sees the truths of the faith that certain things are true, and therefore trusts in the one who tells these things to us. Trusts patiently in the one who hears me, sees me, and pledges his word to me that the things he's brought me to believe, that is the one who absolutely can be trusted in for the things that he promises. And I'm going to trust him. That is biblical faith. That is the faith that justifies sinners, puts us right with God. Faith in him, as well as faith that what he says will prove to be true. We're currently facing an election. I'm not going to make any party political comment here, trust me on that. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether the things that politicians say can be trusted to be true. And I'm waiting for people to start to ask themselves, this person I'm thinking of voting for, can I put my trust in them, in that person? Are they good and right and just and reliable? And there's the crunch issue with God. Am I going to put my trust in him? Is he reliable? Am I going to put my life in his hand? Because if so, then I'm going to take him in his word. Take him at his word. Will I put my trust in him? And will rely on him that the things he tells me will prove to be true. There's the deep dive. God bless you. Have a great week, trusting in him who is reliable, who, as we take him at his word, it will prove that the things he says to us are true.